Kokie kaga desu ka? Watanabe Dan desu. On today's episode of Backward Engineering Your Script, we're going to be discussing the hidden costs of remake culture and why it is that this has made it especially difficult for people who are trying to break into the industry today. But as always, every time there's a minus, there's a plus hidden within that. So let's talk first of all about some of the reasons why remakes can actually be a good idea. The first of these is that remakes can be very justified if there's a new technology that comes in. This was certainly apparent in the 1930s when the new technology was sound. Now, surely there were a lot of people who would complain that the remakes, the talkie remakes, were sometimes inferior to the original silent remakes. On the other hand, there were many that were considered much better because, if nothing else, talkies brought in a whole different dimension of realism that made a lot of these storytelling tropes all the more impactful and effective. Now, in some cases, the talkie version is the only version that we have left of a silent movie that was a classic. For example, London After Midnight, which must go down as the most desired missing silent film. The last version of it was destroyed in an MGM fire in 1974. But the director Todd Browning remade it as Mark of the Vampire in 1935. And while a lot of people complain about the stupid ending, I've got to say that that was the original ending of London After Midnight too, where you find out that the vampires and all of that were part of an undercover detective scheme, sort of like the old Name of the Game series. So maybe it's not such a great loss. Plus, that particular talkie version does show that Todd Browning was indeed a competent director, all of the complaints about his 1931 Dracula notwithstanding. He would go on to direct other good movies for the remainder of his career. Come again to color. In the 1950s, Douglas Sirk did a series of remakes of old black and white movies that were arguably very superior to their original black and white versions, primarily because A. Douglas Sirk was a really, really great filmmaker, but also because he understood how to use color effectively and dramatically. And his updates of things like Magnificent Obsession and Imitation of Life have stood the test of time, perhaps better than their 1930s original incarnations. The other reason is because sometimes you want to add a different ethnic spin to it. Now, this was very true of the Broadway version as well as the feature film of West Side Story, updating Romeo and Juliet to a racial conflict between white gang members and Hispanic Latino gang members. It'll be very interesting to see how Spielberg does a remake of that on the other side of the civil rights movement. Because remember, the original West Side Story was done before the civil rights legislation had passed. So it was a very different time. So let's see whether or not Spielberg brings a new and interesting lens to it. And certainly the fact that you don't have a Greek and playing a Hispanic and a Russian playing a Hispanic might actually help the film to seem a little bit more realistic. I'm going to be honest, I don't have a lot of hope for it. I have a feeling it's going to be cringy beyond belief, but that's just me. The other thing that could happen is that the other example of that is, of course, Carmen Jones, which took the original version of Carmen and updated it to the Black community. Now, a lot of times we'll look at something like Carmen Jones today and find it to be rather racist and cringy, but it was a major leap forward in the 1950s and did make a star out of Dorothy Dandridge. Unfortunately, she made the mistake of sleeping with both the director Otto Preminger and the studio head Darryl Zanuck at the same time, and that probably ultimately cost her career. And the other thing is, building on the Romeo and Juliet one, is sometimes you can switch genres. For example, Arthur Haley, before he wrote Hotel and Airport, wrote a novel called Runway 08, which has been made into a TV movie multiple times. it was also parodied in the film Airplane, which originally was called Flying High, and that's the title it was released under when it was shown in Japan. So that was a very interesting, an interesting thing there. Anyway, so sometimes you can really justify a remake, especially if you're able to take it and change its basic format. But we all know that one of the challenges that we have with remakes right now is that they are not being made for the correct reason. It seems like most remakes today are being based on PowerPoint presentations that are presented by executives because they seem easy. You already have something that's proven itself in the past and has a quote unquote pre-sold title. Now, there is some minor justification to that. And if you're talking about doing a remake as part of a general slate of a lot of original content, and then you're picking something from the past that might not have been necessarily a great classic, and you're bringing it up to date and maybe making it relevant to today's times, that could work very well. Let's take an example of Ocean's 11. As much as the original Ocean's 11 had the nostalgic appeal of being the original Rat Pack movie, it sucks. It's boring, it's pedantic. It was clearly done with everyone on set having a roaring good time and it not translating to what we saw on the screen. When Steven Soderbergh remade it, he found the real key to it. He found an even more impressive cast. I know that I'm going to infuriate people with that, but he also rethought it. So he took what had been kind of a crummy classic, kind of something that you would watch if it was on the Late Show, but not really love. And he turned it into something that was much, much better. Unfortunately, that's not normally the case. And a lot of the remakes that are being done now are very cringy. We only need to look at something where the agenda behind doing the remake was itself a mistake, such as saying, let's remake Ocean's 11 with an all-female cast. Well, all right, I suppose that there's some relevance to doing that. Plus, it is an acknowledgement that that female moviegoers traditionally have been the ones who supported bread and butter pictures when the industry was based on far more realistic financial projections, where you would have a large number of bread and butter films, and in between you would have tentpole films, because tentpole films, which had male leads, tended to do extraordinarily well in the box office, but they were huge risks. So a studio didn't have necessarily the cash flow to do it. Your bread and butter pictures, which kept people going to movies every week, were the ones that were female centric. There's a lot of times when people will look at the list of top box office stars of all time and point out that oh, look, women were very seldom in the number 1 or number 2 positions. That's true, because they weren't in the tent poles. They were in the lower budget films that nonetheless were still A budgets and nonetheless had great returns on investment, often per dollar invested much higher than the tentpole films, as we still see today with a lot of low budget movies way outperforming expectations. But they weren't necessarily the ones that really kicked ass as far as the numbers were concerned. And that's why you didn't have quite so many female stars in the top 10 box office of every year, yet they were considered to be the profit centers of the movie business. This particular metric is now considered verboten, because ever since the Wall Street gang came in the mid 90s and replaced all of the, shall we say, diverse people in management, middle management and upper management, with all almost entirely exclusive white males who are Ivy League graduates, that all of a sudden that particular style of movie making was looked at as being a pain in the ass. Because one of the problems with female-oriented films was that they tended to require better scripts than the tentpole-oriented films, which required better individual scenes. So it was very easy to say women are a pain in the ass to work with, so let's just focus on the male stars and let's focus on making nothing but tentpoles. Okay, well, now you've ruined the business model of making people go to movies every week or having something that inspires people to go every week because you have different fare available all the time. That's not to say we don't have our occasional La La Lands or things like that, which I'm going to say are still super cringy, but to have that as part of the steady diet is now very unknown. And that's one of the reasons why overall movie attendance has dropped precipitously rather than increased, even though the individual film might make a lot more money. The overall box office gross and adjusted dollars is not as healthy as it used to be. Anyway, something like Ocean's 8 should have worked within that. However, it was not written the correct way. It was written with the idea that all we need to do is put women in these roles and not really change the motivations or adapt it. And that's where you have Hollywood believing its Twitter feed, where it says that a lot of times there's this general idea that women and men do not require different kinds of writing, just like different ethnicities don't require different kinds of writing. You can merely take a story that was written for white performers, change the race, and shoot it as is and be fine. That is the worst form of Occidental supremacy I can imagine, because it's assuming that every culture is hegemonic to white people. Now, this is ironic coming from an entertainment industry which claims that it is very diverse and it's seeking greater diversity. No, it isn't. It's seeking to create a greater diversity among the faces you see on the screen, but not in terms of the way you write the content. Look at the recent remake of Mulan, the live action one. That's a perfect example. You actually had Chinese actors in it. You shot it in China, but you had a basically American crew and American writers. Therefore, even though Disney claimed surprise at this, it infuriated the native Chinese audience, which of course looks at that and sees every single flaw that you've put into it. And consequently, they're going to look at it and absolutely hate it. I'm going to say that the recent box office failure of In the Heights, which was not a remake, although you could say it's a Wonderful Life that's been transposed, but whatever. One of the reasons that didn't work is it's not really about the Latino community in Washington Heights. It's actually about what white people think the Latin community in Washington Heights should be like. Therefore, when you added musical numbers to it, it was in effect a minstrel show. And even though it seemed to play really well, so did the Green Pastures in 1935, and so did Flower Drum Song in 1962. But I would be willing to bet that most African Americans who sat through the Green Pastures in the early 30s and most Asians who sat through Flower Drum Song spent a great deal of time watching those two movies hiding behind their hands, because it's so embarrassing when you're trying to take people from a very different culture and completely turn them into Caucasian avatars. No, it doesn't quite work that way. Henceforth, I'm thinking that the new version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs with a Black lead in the center of it is going to be likewise problematic. I do not want to draw an analogy to the 1943 cartoon Coal Black and the Seven Dwarfs, which was considered to be a very innovative cartoon, but for obvious reasons is completely suppressed today. It's much worse than Song of the South, by the way. Although, if you can put aside your cringy feelings the same way I have to when I watch Tokyo Jokio or Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, it does have its moments that really, really shine in terms of artistry. Does that mean that I think it should be unsuppressed? Well, I don't like Tokyo Jokio and Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips being suppressed either. So I'm going to say yes, but that's just from my perspective as an Asian who likes to see everything. Anyway, so even though that kind of falls into one of my reasons for saying a remake is good, one of the things that has to be done when you're doing a remake is to appreciate the culture that you're importing into that remake, not put the culture into the remake as just being casting differently, but not changing the script and the underlying psychology of the characters. Because trust me, as much as Hollywood probably doesn't want to admit it, there is a difference in the way different ethnic groups think. And by the way, that's no different from breaking apart the general Caucasian community. I don't think anyone in their right mind would think that England and France and Greece and Italy are monotheistic, not monotheistic, are monochromatic in terms of their cultural values any more than China, Japan, Korea, and India are. So, you've got to really look at each group based on what its specific differences are and then incorporate that into the script. And with the added feel that you better not make it cringy. I mean, heaven forbid that the new version of Snow White takes the tactic of making it into Coal Black and the Seven Dwarves again, or doing what IKEA recently did when they decided to do a Juneteenth celebration and made it into something that was super cringy by living up to the most grotesque stereotypes of what the average Black would eat. I mean, okay, yeah, you watched a couple of episodes of The Jeffersons and called it a day. No, that's not how you do it. Anyway, the other reason for doing remakes is that a lot of times it's a pre-sold title, but that can be dangerous as well. Now, we've seen what happens when you do that with horror movies. Horror movies tend to be a genre that go forever. So unlike a lot of current movies, where once it gets past a certain age, it looks hopelessly dated and people don't want to partake in it anymore. When the average horror audience looks at something like the 1978 Halloween, they're seeing it as a horror movie of its era. That's true, but they're also loving it for what have now become camp items within it. So when you remake it and you don't really rethink it, you just kind of redo it and you make a little bit more of a focus on Jason because it Mike Myers, because it simply happens to tie more in the cultural zeitgeist of the moment. That could have been okay, but you have to rethink the other parts of the movie, because unlike doing a remake of the Thomas Crown Affair, there are still a lot of horror fans who know that original work by the second, and they don't find it to be outdated and cringy the way somebody might look at the 1967 Thomas Crown Affair and say this thing has no relevance anymore. But Halloween did, because it's a hard genre. So when you start remaking hard genre pieces like Halloween, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, yes, you're updating them, but you're not changing them sufficiently. And all you're doing is you're setting yourself up for a disaster where people are going to compare one to the other. All we need to do is look at the remake of Suspiria, which took, admittedly a movie that has no story and is loaded with style, but is not repeatable in the way it was originally made, and turn it into this 2.5-hour groan fest that is not only endless but really pretentious. Or when you look at a horror movie, you're not really expecting to see a European art film. You don't go see a Dario Argento movie to see a reworking of Fassbinder, and yet that's kind of what that Suspiria did. So this is an example of where you're taking an old title and you're abusing it without getting any kind of financial benefit from it. The other issue is that by constantly focusing on IPs from the past, you're not allowing new voices to emerge. Because certainly if you're going to use something where you have to spend a great deal of cash to acquire the rights, you're not going to hand it over to some newbie filmmaker who's probably better than an experienced writer at actually adapting it because they love the genre and they love the style. No, you're going to go with a high-end writer. And so therefore, it's not going to have that same energy that new blood coming in can give to an older IP. So the actual justification for constantly redoing and rebooting and refranchising titles is that you are disincentivizing new voices, new visions, new ways of thinking, new ways of bringing in content. And therefore, you have someone like Jordan Peele, who did such a great job with Get Out, coming to grief with his follow-ups to that, simply because now he's not being disciplined in the way that he was when he made the first one, by a constrained budget, by a producing team that's looking over his shoulder and just making sure that things kind of conform to what an audience will want. And now you have his brand hurt because of his relaunching of The Twilight Zone and several other IP, where you look at it and go, okay, no. So you got to be very careful about this stuff. Now, what do I think that this can mean for new incoming writers? I think that this incredible focus on the past is now starting to run out of steam. And I know that this is one of those predictions that comes in all the time. But what we're being faced with is the new economic reality in Hollywood, where clearly China is not going to keep on bankrolling failures. In fact, China's made it very clear what they don't want anymore. And your Netflixes and all these other companies, which are still focused on only getting the highest end talent, like Netflix just signed a huge deal with Spielberg. And I'm looking at that going, well, why would you do that? I mean, Spielberg's retired. He's not that relevant anymore. Okay, he's about to release West Side Story, but let's face it, when was the last Steven Spielberg movie that came out that was really innovative and really not just moving forward on the fumes of his past reputation? Certainly wasn't The Post. So we're looking at them spending money on a name that, okay, yeah, he's very big with people of a certain generation, mainly mine, who followed his career in real time. But how many young people truly venerate Spielberg as a brand? I'm going to say about as many that in my age group who are still venerating Alfred Hitchcock as a brand. Yes, I was the prime movie-going age when Family Plot first came out. And while I enjoyed it, it was clearly not relevant to my generation. My generation was the Rocky and Network generation at that point. And here's Family Plot, which is old school. And while I loved it because I was loving watching old movies on TV, I couldn't imagine my fellow people in high school getting anything out of it other than, oh my God, it's a bunch of old people running around acting in this old style that looks like a Columbo episode. And I'm feeling that Spielberg has that same brand now. Ditto for Martin Scorsese. He's not the young rebel of Taxi Driver anymore. He's an old coot like George Cukor when he was doing Rich and Famous. So this focus on old time Hollywood is blocking new voices, and the new voices who are coming in are, and like Jordan Peele and like Ava DuVernay, who are suddenly elevated way beyond what they're perhaps ready for, is very toxic. But I think with Discovery taking over Warner Brothers, with what's going on at Sony, with what's going on at Universal, and this reappreciation for watching your fiscal house, and plus the clarity that streaming is not going to be an ever-increasing model forever into the future. I think there's going to be a fiscal reality that says we need to find new talent. Plus, there's still such a hunger right now for so much new content that there has to be an outreach to new people. I'm still going to say that rather than those of us who are non-Caucasian say, I want a seat at the table, we're still much better off saying, I'm going to build my own table with an independent film or an independent TV series or an independent YouTube channel or something like that, and use that as our launching platform. Okay, I'm old, but for those of you who are who are similarly movie crazy or TV crazy like me, who are looking to break into the business now, to build your own table and take it from there. Let them come to you. Don't keep knocking on a door that right now wants to be stuck on stupid. But watching the old guard be stuck on stupid as you're knocking on the door to come in or starting to create your own table is one of the exciting things about Hollywood. Because you know, once you have created your own table, that the doors will magically open for you and create the new generation of people who look at your work and say, that's why I love the movie.
I did say enjoy our last film, Mr. Buddha.
Enjoy? My dear fellow, we are not so old-fashioned as that. It is not the purpose of the modern cinema to entertain. Never, no. We use our cameras today as a surgeon uses his scalpel.